So let me just show you this. This was the first skull ever found in Africa that is actually part of the human lineage and not an ape. Its discovery was treated with scorn. It was by an Australian-born but London-trained neuroanatomist who was working in South Africa, and as a hobby was looking at fossils. The people back in London, his betters, if you will, the older scientists back there, refused to accept this Tong child. But now we know it's part of the species Australopithecus africanus. Stood about 4 feet high, fully upright and walking, so not unlike a chimpanzee. Brain, however, hardly any larger than a chimpanzee, about the same size, about 450 milliliters. Our brains are about 1350, 1400 milliliters in volume. I mean, this is an amazing fossil because this is a mud cast of actually some of the anatomical landmarks of the brain are actually preserved there. Richard Leakey found this thing, it's ER 1470. I guess I was in graduate school, so I think this was back in the 1960s that Richard found this. I should have said this. Let me go back to this cute guy. It's thought to be a 6-year-old child. This species lived in southern Africa, eastern Africa, between 3 million and 2.5 million years ago, very reliably dated. There was an environmental event that changed the complexion of life very much in Africa 2.5 million years ago, and right then, a couple of other lineages of humans show up, and that other one goes extinct. This is, as I say, Homo habilis. This is Richard Leakey's find. It's got a brain size, if I'm remembering correctly, of about 735 milliliters. It's bigger brain. And I didn't bring any pictures, but it's the first stone tools associated with hominids there. So we're getting smarter. We got stone cultures going. Little over about 1.7, 1.8 million years ago, you get the next step in human evolution. This is the brain size on this Homo ergaster is about what is it? It's about 975, or about, averages out to about 1,000 milliliters. And the stone tools associated with this particular species are more sophisticated, far more sophisticated than they are. And finally, you get us. This is the oldest Homo sapiens skull known. It's about 120,000 years old. So as you go through time, you get bigger brain creatures that look more and more like us. It's the fossil record really. I think does a great job. I'm going to leave that cartoon up in confirming that second prediction, which was that if evolution has happened, there should be a progression in the geological record from the simple to the complex. And you should be able to see these sequences, and indeed you really do. I have to finish my third prediction, is that there should be a spectrum, just as there is a spectrum that interconnects all of life, sort of the fruits of the evolutionary process. There should be a spectrum in evolutionary processes. And I'm not going to discuss this at any great length, much as I would really love to, because that's where I'm living right now. But there is a spectrum from small-scale effects. I tie this in with environmental events that have happened to the Earth. Large-scale environmental events like meteorites smashing into the Earth have changed the complexion of life radically, and you get a very different kind of life replacing what was there before. But there's a whole gradation all the way down to the smallest scale kinds of effects. And as I say, I'd be very, very happy to discuss this with anybody. But I see that I have just enough time now to give you, so those are the 3 predictions. I think they're abundantly confirmed. Doesn't prove because science doesn't prove anything beyond a shadow of a doubt that evolution has occurred, but evolution has resisted strenuous attempts to falsify it, looking at these predictions and still others in detailed micro sort of predictions, has taken a licking and is standing there and still ticking, and is the only scientific explanation still, as it was back in the 1860s, right after Darwin published, explanation of the diversity of life that we see on the face of the Earth. Now, I said that I also, though, want to turn my attention to intelligent design, because I think that it's true, as I said, that there are no attempts that I'm aware of, serious attempts to test the proposition of intelligent design. So in particular, it occurred to me that intelligent designers ought to be looking at the details of systems that we know were intelligently designed to see what kind of patterns that you have in the history of those kinds of systems. And we know that there are intelligently designed systems because we are intelligent designers. We design computers, we design cars, we design mousetraps. I understand that Mike Behe talked about mousetraps. I wonder if Mike Behe has looked at the history of mousetraps. I don't think anybody has. But it would be very interesting. And what kind of predictions would you make for a history of computers, say, or watches? That's another area that creationists like to talk about, the complexities of watches. And you couldn't have a random sort of assortment of things to put together a watch. The existence of a watch bespeaks a watchmaker, that kind of an argument. What about the history of watches? Now, just think about it. Anything that you know of in detail in your own personal lives, you know how clever people are. A good idea comes along, it's very often taken immediately and applied to other similar kinds of situations. So what I'm saying is I would predict, and I went around the halls of the museum a couple of months ago and asked people what would they predict for a material cultural, like cars or computers or something like that, design system. What kind of predictions would you make about what the patterns ought to look like there if you really studied the history? And they said chaos. You wouldn't get this kind of, if not absolute chaos, you would not get this kind of neat resolution that you get whenever you actually go out and analyze a chunk of biological nature and find that just as evolution would predict, you're getting these nice nested sets of patterns of resemblance that link things up in a nice, orderly, basic fashion. No, you wouldn't, because if you get a good idea in one part of the system, it can be applied retroactively over to another part of the system. There's nothing constraining the transmission of the information the way genes are constrained in the biological system when it comes to human cleverness and making permutations and combinations of various different kinds of designs in any particular system that basically you can think of. All right, that's the prediction. How are we going to test that? Well, we need people to go out and actually look at the histories of material cultural design. And there are histories of pianos and violins. I'm very interested in musical instruments, as this cartoon reveals. People have written histories, I guess, of watches and so forth, but not, I don't think, particularly with this end in view. And I must say about myself, I said the focus shifts. There's a trilobite here. This is very similar to the trilobite in cartoon form, of course, that led to the notion of punctuated equilibria back in the 1970s. But since the 80s, I've been very interested, just as a hobby, starting out as a hobby, collecting cornets. I used to be a cornet and trumpet player, and probably some of you are out here as well, and started finding these things and collecting them. And then I started getting interested in the history of them. And I have now got an article in press, just to show you that this is, I'm not making this up. I have now got an article in press, which when it comes out in a month or two, I just got a communication about it today since I've been here, will be the definitive history of the cornet, at least so far. And it's being published in the Historic Brass Society Journal. So this is not rank amateurism here. I'm actually sort of a world expert in these. So it occurred to me to make that prediction. Here's an intelligently designed system. Let's see what the history looked like from this point of view, and what kind of patterns do you get. Now, you're going to have to bear with me. I have to give you a little lecture on the history of the cornets, just to sort of establish sort of the bona fides of the situation. When I was a kid, this was my high school trumpet here, and it's a standard trumpet. And trumpets are very stable. They haven't changed very much since the late 1880s, basically. They're monotonous, at least these piston valve trumpets. The cornet down here was the pair to that, and they were made by the same maker. And they're very similar, and to the ear, you can't really tell them apart. They sound very much the same, but you can notice that there's an extra turn here. That's a holdover from the old days. The cornets have an full extra turn to the windway. The mouthpiece is a little bit smaller. Traditionally, it was much deeper. It was much more like a French horn kind of a mouthpiece. And there's more of a taper to the entire instrument, so you supposedly get a more mellow sound and so forth. But again, by the 1950s, that was largely a fiction. That was a memory. That was really cornets were just an alternate version of making a trumpet, and most band directors would tell you that you couldn't tell the sound apart from them, however adequately or inadequately they were being played. Cornet goes back to 1825, and we've now nailed this down pretty well because there's a patent of 1829 that says, well, about 4 years ago, this guy Allery in Paris stuck 2 valves on a post horn. And this is the oldest style cornet that we know of. It's not the oldest cornet we know of, but I happen to own this, so I make a picture of it very easily. But we know that this thing came into existence in about 1825. It's got the old-fashioned kind of valve called a Stölzel valve, and the windway actually comes out here and goes into the bell, and when it comes from the mouthpiece, which is not in the instrument right now, goes around and around and goes into the bottom of the valve here. And to change the pitch on these instruments, if you push the valve down, then the air goes through here. And if you push this valve down, the air goes through here. There are only 2 valves, as you can readily see on this instrument, so that the very first thing that happened in cornet history, improvement if you will, was to add a 3rd valve. Why? Because it gives you the whole chromatic scale all the way. You could play in the lower register all the way down, nice and smooth, as I say, chromatically up and down. One thing you can't see, and I'm sorry about this, on this diagram, is that these valves are offset. And the reason why they're offset is when this 3rd valve was added, here's the tube coming out from, oops, there I go again. 3rd valve slide coming out here. What to do with the 2nd valve slide, because your hand is actually holding the instrument right here. So they folded the 2nd valve slide back here. You can barely see it. Here's the tube of it here, and then it comes around. You can just see it curving in back there. And so to make that work and have that line flat, they had to stick the 2nd valve, offset it further out. So that's something that's important because it changes as we go through time. Here's a very important instrument. It's the first modern valve cornet that we know about, and it was made by Adolphe Sax right after he got to Paris. It's a very interesting instrument. It looks exactly like the horn I just showed you, except the air. This is kind of fun. Just like the first cars were really buckboards that somebody took the horse off and stuck a motor on, you know, before you could realize you could then start redesigning what that was all about. So the motorized buckboard was the first car. Well, here we have a cornet with the first modern valves on it, but the air no longer goes through the bottom of the valves because it's a completely different kind of a design of a valve, but they wanted the instrument to look like the familiar cornet. So it's basically, it's the analogy there with a motorized buckboard. 1842, you get that. Then they started lengthening them into more of a modern kind of a configuration. So this is in the 1850s. Again, in the 1850s is the first time you find an instrument, it's called the English model because they were very popular in London, with a bell, this is the bell, on the left-hand side of the valves, not the right-hand side of the valves. Okay. And then finally, by the late 1860s, you have essentially the modern cornet. There's there's a detachable pipe here, which we got rid of, and the shepherd's crook was not in that first picture I showed you. But the valve that's here is exactly the same as the valve 1860s is my 1950s cornet that I started out with. So basically, most of the design features and changes in what I would call the evolution of the cornet were in place between 1825 and the 1860s, and then there was just some minor stuff that happened along the way in the intervening eras. But here, this summarizes the whole point right here. Here is an instrument made in the late 1800s, and I can't be more specific about it. What happened was this old type of valve continued in production. These instruments became the cheapest models that you could make, that you could buy. Very cheap. You could get one of these things for $5 back in the 1880s, and they were all imported from Europe, but they were still popular in the United States. This thing was sold in the United States. But look at this. You've got, instead of having the bell on the right-hand side, it's on the left-hand side, like almost all modern cornets were. They just decided to redesign that old cornet and keep pace with modern changes and slap that bell over on the left-hand side. They brought the 2nd valve slide over to the right-hand side. To tell you the truth, I don't know why they couldn't have done that in the first place, and now the valves are in line. There are tons of examples like this, but you can see that this is retrofitting. This is taking that old original design, the first 3-valve cornopian, and in effect modernizing it ex post facto so that it's in conformance with the more expensive models with a newer valve on them that everybody was buying. But you could still get these cheapo valves and still get a cornet, but at least it could be configured more or less like the more expensive cornets that other people were buying, and you were stuck. Your mother bought you this particular cheapo version. So it's retrofitting. You see this time and time again. I just don't want to go into too many more examples. In fact, I won't. So anyway, that's the modern thing. Now, just a refresher, this is my trilobite diagram. You always get this. Is it the truth? No, it's an approximation of the truth, but you always get these good resolution. You very seldom get lack of resolution in these diagrams. Look, as you would predict, what you get with the cornets. There's no resolution here at all. This is an artifact of the way I scored some of the valves. I have a separate score for 1854 patent and 1855 patent and so forth. So it aligned them that way. When you get up to the modern ones, they don't resolve. There's some interesting structure in here. This is all the second kind of valve. So it's not true that there's no structure at all. There is some structure in these. And just to cut to the chase, I forced the computer to tell the difference between that ancient kind of valve and the modern kind of valve. I said, at least let's pull those apart. I did it artificially. And so these are the ancient ones. This is the 2-valve one up here. These are the 3-valve one up here. And these are all the ones that have the new kind, the modern kind of valve on them. And you can see that, for example, this is the first one with the English bell. All right, now this is the valves in line. Here's the English bell business. This is the first one with an English bell, and that design was applied retroactively to these older designs and even down to the cornopians, which is what I just showed you, that slide that I showed you before. Have I falsified intelligent design? No, of course not. But I've made some predictions about what it ought to look like. You know, there was a scientific creationist, there is, I guess, still, Gary Parker, who wrote a book in the 70s, and the name of the book eludes me, and he said that with a creator out there fashioning life, the creator could do whatever he wanted and put different features of different organisms wherever that seemed like a good place to put them. He denied that there was this nested pattern of resemblance that links up all of life. I think that we have to say, or I certainly will say, that there is that nested pattern out there. But his description very accurately fits what cornet makers were doing all the time, because they were able to make permutations and combinations, apply new ideas to older designs, and make these, as I say, just this sort of almost infinite number of combinations of characteristics which do not resolve neatly into these, into the kinds of trees that you see. Now, so what does that show? That shows that the prediction is right about an intelligent design, at least human intelligent design systems, but it does not conform to the overwhelming patterns that you see when you look at life and you analyze life, you analyze the history of life, and look at the characteristic patterns there. Those are consistent with the predictions of organic evolution, and the cornets are consistent with the general predictions that you would make for intelligent design. Again, it doesn't falsify intelligent design, but until I see a lot more experiments done on intelligently designed systems, and it's not unfair of me to pick human designed systems because mousetraps are human designed systems, and they were featured, as I understand it, fairly prominently in the lecture last night. So I think the intelligent design people owe it to themselves and all the rest of us to get positive, go out there and look at and analyze the details of what we know to be intelligently designed systems. And let's see how that jibes with what we know to be true about what the history of life looks like. Thank you very much.
We have time now for a few questions.
Question way back there? Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't realize that. Sorry.
Afternoon.
Good afternoon.
I have a question for you. Considering your statement that evolution moves from the simple to the complex, how do we explain continued longevity, success, and modern existence of really simple species like the amoeba?
Yeah, evolution does, bacteria are even better. Bacteria are running the ecological show out there. Just a ratcheting up of complexity does not mean better. And mammals are not doing the same kind of job out there ecologically that bacteria are. So the bacteria are not endangered by the presence of mammals. We're just sort of lucky to be here and are living almost as epiphenomena on the chemical matrix that is actually supplied by bacteria. That's what I would say. So you get this ratcheting up of complexity. It's an interesting issue why you would even get that at all. But it does not mean in any case that it spells doom for what came before it. Sometimes you can make a case out like that. For instance, in the human evolution thing, that maybe those bigger brain ones might have been around and driven out the smaller brain creatures. We have about the same brain size as Neanderthals, and I think there's almost no doubt that we killed the Neanderthals off when we got to Europe about 38,000 years ago. It took about 5,000. Now, they had the same size brain, but it wasn't configured like ours. They were not the same species. So it's not like we had a bigger brain, but we were smarter. I think there's no question about that. And we managed to outcompete and either kill off or just outcompete Neanderthals. So you get those kinds of things on a very close level. But on the gross level like that, bacteria are perfectly safe because they're running the show. So,
sir, I have sort of a two-part question. You mentioned briefly the fossil record. Why is it that we see so few, if any, transitional fossils? And if your answer to this is punctuated equilibrium, is there any other evidence for this idea, or is it just an excuse for the lack of transitional fossils in the fossil record?
Well, transitional fossils are in the eye of the beholder. Now I wish I had taken the time to get that assembly of the mammal-like reptiles that I spoke about but didn't bring the illustrations for into true mammals over periods of several tens of millions of years in the southern hemisphere, bridging the Triassic to the Jurassic. But I'll put it to you that my series of 4 slides showing Australopithecus africanus, Homo habilis, Homo ergaster, and then Homo sapiens is a transitional series, absolutely a transitional series. And if I had had the skulls with me, I have casts of all of these at home. I didn't want to bring them out. They're delicate. I thought the slides would suffice, and I'd invite you up to see them. I don't think there'd be much dispute about the spectrum.
Is it any evolutionary model or algorithm which would explain how bacteria acquire or develop the apoptosis machinery? Apoptosis,
you mean cell death?
Yes,
I'm not,
PCD.
Yeah, I'm not a biochemist, a molecular biologist, or even a medical doctor, so I'm not really competent to speak about that. The eukaryotic cell, apparently though, and I follow Lynn Margulis on this, is not quite your question, but it's the best I can really do, seems to have arisen as a fusion of 2 different kinds of bacterial cells. And so the mitochondrial DNA comes in separately from a different kind of a bacterium. And so Lynn Margulis has got this notion that the early on complexification, the origin of the eukaryotic cell from the prokaryotic cell, was a kind of a symbiosis that actually stuck and became obligatory. Apoptosis, that's when the cells can only divide so many times, basically, is what we're talking about, and then they undergo cell death. It's very important, and I just heard a lecture about this from David Baltimore in Denmark last week. It's a mystery, basically, how that even works still, and let alone how it actually originated. It's very important, though, in combating cancer, because cancer seems to be the elimination of this control of the number of generations that a cell can undergo. So he was talking about basically the new drug Gleevec that's working on what is it, leukemia right now. You know, it's interesting. So I don't know. I'm not even qualified. I'm not even that kind of a biologist who would really know, but I don't think people in general know the answer to that question. But that raises another issue. People say, intelligent design people are apt to say, well, you can't explain this, it's too complex. And it's sort of the generic rejoinder to that is at the molecular level or even at the biochemical level. We didn't even know about the existence of proteins until I think it was the 1880s as chemical elements. We didn't know that DNA, we didn't know what DNA was and that it was somehow implicated in the transmission of heritable information during reproduction until the 1920s, and then Watson and Crick came along and figured out the structure of it. Then after the structure was figured out, then people were able to sit down and try to understand how that information is organized and actually transmitted on that molecule. In other words, there are mysteries out there that science is attacking and has done a pretty good job pushing back the levels of ignorance here. That we haven't actually found out absolutely everything yet, I think is a kind of a poor criticism. I think if you really look at what's been learned in the last century or so, it's just absolutely amazing. And there's no reason to think that we're going to stop there, including coming up with an answer to the question that you just asked.
I have a critique or question about your analysis for intelligent design and the basis for the intelligent systems you're talking about in regards to the coronet. It seemed that the different changes made to previous systems were kind of aha statements, like a child playing with Legos, figuring out he can do more things with the different pieces he acquires. Is that a fair characterization of what you're saying about intelligent systems?
No, I think that people are running businesses. They're selling coronets. They want to market them.
Right.
Right?
But
so,
it was more like a new development can be applied to a past system because we figured out we could do that.
Right.
And I think with an intelligent designer, the implication was that the intelligence is greater than human intelligence, where those kind of things could have been thought of before.
Okay, that's a fair enough criticism. All I'm trying to do is lift the debate up to a level, and all I'm suggesting is that since we can't test directly, nobody's come up with a test of the intelligent designer, let's at least look at systems that we know have been intelligently designed. That was the whole purport of that, and it's the best I could do, because I can't come up with a test for the supernatural any more than the intelligent design people themselves can.
We've heard a lot of arguments that intelligent design is not science, and Behe addressed this last night by saying that idea is an inductive science, and that inductive science has been kind of a historically accepted way to do science, and I just wondered how you'd respond to that.
Inductive science is basically, that's the sort of, you get the idea. That's the inductive part of it. But there has to be some way of testing that idea with the evidence of your senses. I mean, I take a very narrow view of science. It's about the material world. We all acknowledge that it really exists. And so it's a set of rules on how to go out and experience that and test propositions about the nature, the function, the structure, and the history of that physical world that exists out there. So pure induction won't do it. It won't do it, at least in the annals of modern science. You won't get a grant from the National Science Foundation. You know, we won't discover the cure for AIDS that way. So real science plays by the rules of empirical evidence that come, and your choice of looking for the evidence is based on the sort of the logical corollaries that come from a overall statement which could have been inductively derived, but you have to make that second step and go out and test it to make it really a science.
Before you said that the intelligent designers had no positive test to prove intelligence.
I said that I wasn't aware that they did.
Okay. How do you characterize irreducible complexity and blood clotting, bacterial flagella, things like that aren't necessarily attacking evolution?
Those are arguments sheerly based on complexity. There is no further statement saying that. So if we can't explain this through natural selection, so let's devise a test so we can, or let's falsify by some sort of a test other than just an argument that evolution could not have produced the flagellum, for example. And let's go further, though, and say, if it weren't that, and then instead of just saying, and there's the form of the argument, always is, well, I'm casting doubt on the evolutionary argument, so therefore the only thing that's left over, it must be intelligent design. That won't work, because you've got to say, how are we going to test the notion that it's intelligent design that actually created this particular structure, and call it science?
But the only way for them to prove themselves would be able to prove that there is a God. I mean,
well, actually, the last time I got involved it was out in Cal State Fullerton, and the young man I was debating didn't want me to say God. I mean, I would have said what you just said, but he didn't want to do that, and so then I was really
That's
at a
the way
loss.
I believe. So
Yeah,
that's the way I
yeah,
say
right.
it,
And I think that's being very honest of you to say that, as a matter of fact.
I have a question about earlier in your lecture, you had said that science can never show any absolute truth. Aren't you claiming then that you have absolute truth in saying that?
No, I'm just saying it's the rules of the game. It's just the rules of it's just a logical necessity of the rules of the game. And I didn't say there was no such thing as absolute truth. I'm saying that the conclusions of science can never be posited as being absolutely true. And if that's an absolute truth that I've just given you, that has nothing to do with the veracity of what I said about science.
Yeah, this has been a long questioning session. It occurred to me, I've heard you and a couple other evolutionists say, you know, you ideas give us a test. I wanted to propose a test because just last night this occurred to me when he was talking about somebody trying to counter his test. Specifically, my test would be create those transitional forms now, living transitional forms, by devolving existing creatures. I believe the technology for this exists. And if you could do that, then I would be persuaded of your position. If not, I might be more persuaded of the idea.
No, but I'm asking you to give a test of your position.
Well, I offer that as the test. I offer
No,
that if you will do that test, it will...
You're purporting to test what I'm saying, and you're not allowing me to ask you to test what you're saying. So,
in early 1990, I took a class in cultural anthropology.
yeah.
And I was taught about those transitional human fossils, the record.
Right.
And the Neanderthals, we were taught, were intelligent human beings. They
culture.
They used fire, and there was evidence that they even had a rich religious life. And then a few years later, the report came out that DNA showed that there was no connection between, there was no relationship between the Neanderthals and the modern humans. What happened?
Oh, and actually, the version I gave you, I have to say, in Michigan, up in Ann Arbor, Milford Walpoff would disagree with what I'm saying. So this is still being debated.
Do they still
But the
believe
DNA is indeed different. That was out of a, I don't know, some part of a skull of a Neanderthal. As I understand it, the prevailing viewpoint now of paleoanthropologists on this subject is that, well, of course, they're a form of human being, but they split off from our lineage about 500,000 years ago when the ice ages, was the second or third ice age in Europe. Basically, they were trapped, and they became a people of the ice ages, whereas our species evolved somewhat later back in Africa. And so there might have even been possible hybridization. We don't know. Some people have speculated that yes and no. And the old joke is that if you put a hat and a coat on a Neanderthal and stuck them on a New York City subway, nobody would be able to tell the difference, you know, that kind of thing. So this is iffy, but the interpretation I gave you is partly based on the DNA, partly based on the anatomy and the anatomical differences, and the cultural differences as seen in the stone tools, which is a little bit iffier. But it's also the archaeological record. You can actually document the arrival of anatomically modern human beings who look a lot different from the massive Neanderthals. In Europe, I think it's about 38,000, 39,000 years ago now, and then you see the coexistence of them down to about 32,000, 31,000 years ago, and then the Neanderthals disappear. So I think sort of the most, the simplest interpretation there would be that we were different lineages, and we were not just intermingling and intermarrying and interbreeding, but rather viewed each other hostilely, and that one was there for hundreds of thousands of years, and then the other one, us, shows up, and then 5,000 years later, the other ones aren't there anymore.
Okay, so let me ask you. In the early 1990s, there may have been a Neanderthal in that transitional picture of the...
oh, no, not on my slides, not in my whole lifetime. have I ever thought that? Absolutely not.
But when I took my children a few months later to the museum, the Neanderthal was ripped from the chain. He was no longer in the progression.
Okay. My answer to that is, and I told you on all of these diagrams I showed that they're subject to revision. And what I was really basically after was the geometry and the bifurcation kind of scheme that you get. It doesn't mean that we have the absolute truth, and more information can come along and change the picture. Another example I gave you was that the date for the base of the Cambrian has changed since I made that slide.
Okay. We have time for one more question. Okay.
You spoke about the progression from Australopithecus to Homo habilis and so on to Homo sapiens, and I was just wondering if you could speak briefly on how the Australopithecus is differentiated from the chimpanzee, because you said they were very similar.
Upright and walking with a pelvis that looks like our pelvis and not like a chimp pelvis, which is elongated.
Okay. How, all you had on the picture was the skull. Is there more?
Oh yeah, we have.
Okay, I wasn't aware of that. And then how are the four fossils connected between each other to?
Well, they're all African. They are, that little guy, the first one I showed you, that species is known to have existed between 3 million and 2.5 million years ago. There was a major environmental disruption in Africa, which I really didn't have time to go into, but it basically meant things became cooler and drier, and it changed the ecosystems of eastern and southern Africa radically. A lot of things became extinct. Apparently, that species included, but you can't really, but it disappears from the fossil record. The other side of the line, you get the next one up. The skull that I showed you is from another, so 2.5 million years ago, is from another 500,000 years later, but the bones of that particular species are known right down there at that line. So it's basically, it's boom, boom, right there. They're cheek by jowl. You get the one kind replaced by the more advanced kind. Thank you.